The diamond was too bright. That's the first thing I noticed, how the late afternoon sun caught the facets of that 5-carat rock, fracturing the light into 1,000 jagged needles that seemed to stab at my retinas. Ellis? Julian's voice was like warm honey, the kind that coats a sore throat and makes you believe everything is going to be okay. He was down on one knee, his designer suit trousers pressing into the Italian marble of the balcony. Behind him, the sky over Obsidian Heights was a bruised purple, bleeding into a toxic orange. It was the kind of sunset people take photos of to prove they're happy. I couldn't breathe, not because I was a blushing bride-to-be, but because I was smelling things that weren't there. I smelled the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. I smelled burning rubber and the sickly sweet scent of high-octane fuel leaking onto wet asphalt. 1 second ago, or was it a lifetime ago, I was upside down. My hair was matted with blood, and the world was screaming in the sound of grinding metal. I remember the rain. It had been cold, washing over the windshield of my crumpled car, and I remember Julian. He wasn't kneeling then. He was standing over the wreckage, checking his watch with a look of mild annoyance, waiting for my pulse to stop so he could call the police and play the grieving widower. But now, here he was, breathing, smelling of expensive sandalwood and lies. "Ellis, my love, you're shaking." He reached out, his hand steady and warm to take mine. My skin crawled. It took every ounce of my soul not to recoil, not to scream until my lungs burst. To the world, I probably looked overwhelmed, a girl losing her mind at the sheer romance of a cliffside proposal. But inside, I was a ghost. I was a woman who had seen the end of her own story and was suddenly, inexplicably, dropped back at the beginning of the final chapter. October 14th. I knew that date. I felt it in my marrow. This was the day my father, the man I called father anyway, announced the merger that would consolidate the Vance Tech patents. This was the day I signed my life away, thinking I was signing a marriage license. "Yes," I whispered. The word felt like a shard of glass in my throat. I had to say it. If I ran now, if I fought him now, I'd be the hysterical girl. I'd be the unstable heiress they always whispered about. I needed him to think I was still the doormat. I needed him to believe I was still his puppet. He slid the ring onto my finger. It was heavy. It felt like a handcuff. "I knew you would," Julian murmured, standing up and pulling me into a hug. His heart beat against my chest. Thump, thump, thump. A living, breathing heart that I had watched stop in my dreams. Over his shoulder, I looked toward the glass doors of the estate. Standing there, framed by the shadows of the hallway, was Mia, my stepsister. She was holding a flute of champagne, her face a mask of practiced joy. But I saw it now. I saw the way her fingers tightened around the glass. I saw the predatory flicker in her eyes as she looked at Julian. In my first life, I thought that look was pride. I thought she was happy for me. Now, I knew it was the look of a woman watching her investment pay off. "You have no idea," I thought, staring straight into Mia's eyes over Julian's shoulder. "You think you've won. You think you've trapped the little bird in the gilded cage again." I let out a small, shaky sob, completely fake, and buried my face in Julian's neck. He patted my back, his touch patronizing and light. He didn't realize he was holding a corpse that climbed out of the grave. The confession part of me wants to tell you that I felt powerful in that moment, that I felt like a superhero who had been given a second chance. But the truth? I was terrified. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I realized that for the next 365 days, I would have to wake up every morning and kiss the man who killed me. I would have to share meals with the sister who plotted my ending. I looked down at the diamond on my hand. It was beautiful. It was a masterpiece of light and shadow, just like my life. "Everything is going to change now, Ellis," Julian whispered in my ear, his breath hot and stifling. "You have no idea, Julian," I replied, my voice finally steadying into something cold and sharp. "A whole new life." I looked out past the balcony, down toward the jagged rocks where the ocean churned white and violent. In a year's time, that's where my car would be. But as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging Obsidian Heights into darkness, I made a silent vow to the woman I used to be. This time, I wouldn't be the one in the car. This time, I wouldn't be the one screaming for help while the rain washed my life away. The hunt had begun, and Julian, he was still smiling, completely unaware that he had just handed the knife to his own executioner. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. In my previous life, I used to sleep late, wrapped in the silk sheets of Obsidian Heights like a cocoon, dreaming of wedding veils and white lilies. Not anymore. Now, sleep felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, a lapse in the guard that might let the nightmare slip back in. I spent 30 minutes in front of the vanity mirror, practiced and still. I called it my porcelain mask. I applied the foundation to hide the dark circles of a woman who had spent the night mapping out the next 12 months of corporate history. I painted on a soft petal pink lipstick, the color of innocence, the color of a girl who didn't know how to say no. By the time I walked down to the breakfast veranda, I was a masterpiece of deception. "There she is, the woman of the hour," Mia chirped. She was already seated, picking out a plate of dragon fruit and looking every bit the doting stepsister. I felt a wave of nausea, but I forced it down, replacing it with a giddy, breathless laugh. "I still can't believe it, Mia. I keep looking at the ring just to make sure I didn't dream it." I sat across from her, the silver cutlery gleaming between us like surgical tools. This was the woman who had helped Julian plan my accident. In my first life, I had shared everything with her, my fears, my passwords, my heart. Watching her now was like looking at a beautiful snake and wondering how I'd ever mistaken the hiss for a song. "You deserve it, Ellis," Mia said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Julian is so devoted to you, and with the merger coming up, the Vance name is going to be unstoppable." There it was, the hook. "Actually," I said, leaning in as if sharing a delicious secret, "I was thinking about that this morning. I want to show Julian how much I trust him. I'm thinking of moving my personal inheritance into a joint management account before the wedding to show Papa that we're a united front." I watched her. I watched the way her pupils dilated, just a fraction. I watched the way her hand paused, midair with a piece of fruit. To anyone else, it was a sisterly interest. To me, it was the sight of a predator seeing the trap spring shut. Only she didn't realize she was the one inside the cage. "That's incredibly generous, Ellis," Mia breathed, her voice tight with suppressed greed. "Julian would be so moved. Are you sure? You know how protective Papa is over your mother's trust." "Papa will understand," I said, offering her a wide, vacant smile. "It's all in the family, right?" That was the first lie. The joint account was a ghost, a digital labyrinth Silas and I would eventually use to funnel Julian's own funds into a black hole. But for now, it was the bait to keep them focused on the money while I moved the real pieces. After brunch, I retreated to my art studio, a glass-walled room at the edge of the estate. In my first life, I painted mediocre landscapes here. Now, the easels held canvases that acted as shields. Behind a massive oil painting of the valley, I kept a sleek, encrypted laptop that didn't exist on the house's network. My fingers flew across the keys. I wasn't painting. I was liquidating. Through my future memories, I knew which tech startups were about to explode and which Vance subsidiaries were secretly hemorrhaging cash. I began selling off my personal jewelry and minor stocks through a series of shell companies Silas had helped me set up in the dark hours of the night. Bit by bit, the Ellis they knew, the wealthy, stagnant heiress, was becoming a hollow shell. I was turning myself into a ghost before they could kill me. The tension in my chest only tightened when the door creaked open. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The air always seemed to get colder when Arthur Vance entered a room. "You're working hard, Ellis," my father said. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the bright hallway. He didn't come in. He loomed. "Just some sketches for the gala decorations, Papa," I said, my voice light, my hand steady, as I surreptitiously closed the laptop and slid it into the hidden compartment of my desk. I turned, giving him the porcelain mask. He walked toward me, his eyes cold, calculating, and disturbingly familiar, scanning the room. He stopped at the window, looking out over the cliffs. "Julian tells me you accepted. A wise choice. The Vance legacy requires stability." "I want to make you proud, Papa," I said. It was the hardest sentence I'd ever spoken. He looked at me then, really looked at me. For a terrifying second, I wondered if he could see the other Ellis, the one with the bloody forehead and the broken heart. He was a man built on secrets. Surely he could recognize one in his own daughter. "You seem different today," he murmured, stepping closer. He reached out, tucking a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was clinical, like a scientist examining a specimen. "Sharper, less like your mother." "Is that a bad thing?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Arthur smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It never did. "Not necessarily. Just make sure that sharpness is pointed in the right direction, Ellis. I would hate for you to hurt yourself." The threat was thinly veiled, a low hum of electricity in the air. He knew something was off, but he was arrogant enough to think he still controlled the board. He turned and left without another word. I stayed frozen until the sound of his footsteps faded into the marble echoes of the hallway. I collapsed into my chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wasn't just fighting Julian and Mia. I was fighting a man who had built a throne out of bones. I pulled the laptop back out. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was a diamond. I didn't just need to take their money. I didn't just need to break their hearts. I needed to erase them. I opened an encrypted chat window. Only one contact was active. Shadow S. "Ellis, the bait is taken. They think I'm handing over the keys to the kingdom. We need to move faster." Shadow S. "I'm already in their servers. But Ellis, be careful. I found something in Julian's private logs. He's not just planning a wedding. He's looking for a specialist." My blood turned to ice. A specialist? In my last life, the specialist had been the one to ensure the brakes failed on a rainy Tuesday. I looked at the engagement ring on my finger. It wasn't a diamond anymore. It was a countdown. To find Silas Thorne, I had to shed the skin of Ellis Vance. In my first life, I wouldn't have known how to disappear. I was a creature of schedules and surveillance, a pampered bird who thought the golden bars of my cage were part of the architecture. But death is a hell of a teacher. It teaches you that the world doesn't end at the edge of the estate. It just gets darker, faster, and more honest. I left Obsidian Heights at 11 p.m. I wore a nondescript black hoodie and jeans I'd bought with cash from a thrift store, items that felt like sacrilege against the silk-lined life I usually led. I bypassed the main gates using a maintenance tunnel I'd discovered in a forgotten blueprint months before my accident in the previous timeline. The city's industrial district, the Iron Basin, was a graveyard of rusted dreams. I found the address tucked behind a flickering neon sign for a laundromat that hadn't seen a customer since the 90s. The air down here smelled of damp concrete and ozone. My designer boots, the only thing I couldn't bring myself to swap, clicked rhythmically on the stairs as I descended into the basement. My heart was a frantic drum, but my face? My face was marble. I knocked. A heavy, rhythmic sequence I'd memorized from the police reports I'd read after Silas's suicide in my first life. The door didn't open. A small slot slid back, revealing a pair of eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in a decade. The V-Core patent is a lie, and Julian is going to use the Icarus exploit to crash your servers at midnight on the 15th. You have 4 days. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Then the sound of 3 heavy deadbolts sliding back. The room was a cathedral of discarded tech. Monitors glowed like stained glass, casting blue and green shadows over a man who looked like he'd been dragged through hell and decided to stay there. Silas Thorne was taller than he looked in the news clippings. He was lean, jagged, and radiated a kinetic energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. "The heiress," he spat, leaning against a workbench covered with soldering irons and stripped wires. "Julian sent you to finish the job?" "Julian doesn't know I'm here," I said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind me. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked to the center of his workspace, looking at the lines of code scrolling across his main terminal. And if he did, he'd already have sent the specialist to make sure I never made it back. Silas let out a harsh, dry laugh. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ellis. You think because you read a few tech blogs you can walk into my world and talk about exploits? Icarus is a myth, a ghost story for programmers." "It's not a myth. It's a backdoor Julian's team built into the Vance OS 5 years ago. They're going to use it to frame you for the data breach at the National Reserve," I said, stepping closer until I could see the flecks of gold in his dark, suspicious eyes. "I know because I saw it happen. I saw your face on every news channel. I saw you lose everything." I realized, too late, that I'd used the past tense. I saw it happen. Silas's expression shifted. The cynicism didn't vanish, but it was joined by a sharp, predatory curiosity. He moved fast, faster than I expected, pinning me against the cold brick wall. He didn't hurt me, but his presence was overwhelming, a storm of anger and desperation. "Who are you?" he hissed. "The Ellis Vance I know can't even tell the difference between a motherboard and a cutting board. She's a doll, a pretty hollow thing Julian keeps on his arm to look respectable. You're talking like someone who's already seen the funeral." I didn't flinch. I looked him dead in the eye, the porcelain mask finally cracking to reveal the cold fire beneath. "The Ellis you knew is dead. She died on a rainy road with no brakes and a husband who didn't even look back. I'm what's left, and I'm the only person in this city who can help you bury Julian Vance before he buries you." I felt his grip on my arms loosen, but he didn't move away. He was breathing hard, his gaze searching my face for the lie he was so sure was there. He was looking for the spoiled princess, but all he found was a woman with the eyes of a soldier. "You're insane," he breathed, but there was a tremor in his voice, a spark of hope he was trying desperately to smother. "Maybe, but I have the encryption keys to Julian's private cloud. I have the dates of every accidental failure his company is going to have this year, and I have enough money to buy the silence of every man Julian thinks he owns." I turned to him, extending a hand. "I don't want your soul, Silas. I just want your hands. Help me dismantle the empire, and I'll give you the one thing Julian took from you." "What's that?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "The truth," I said, "and the front row seat to watch him burn." Silas stared at my hand as if it were a coiled viper. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like the air itself might catch fire. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a reminder of the world that was still coming for both of us. Slowly, his fingers closed around mine. His hand was rough and scarred and burning hot. "Fine," he said, his voice a jagged edge. "But if this is a trap, Ellis, I'll make sure you're the first one into the fire." "Deal," I said. But as I looked at the way he was watching me, not with hate, but with a terrifying, familiar intensity, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something about the way he moved, the way he anticipated my words. I had come here to recruit a weapon, but as Silas turned back to his keyboard, his fingers flying with a frantic, desperate speed, I realized I might have just stepped into a different kind of trap altogether. Because Silas Thorne didn't look like a man hearing this the first time. He looked like a man who had been waiting for me to show up for a very, very long time. The basement felt like a submarine submerged in an ocean of secrets. It was 3 a.m., that hollow hour where the world feels thin and every shadow looks like a memory. The only light came from a dozen monitors, bathing us in a ghostly electric blue. I sat on a milk crate next to Silas, my hands hovering over a keyboard. In my first life, I didn't know the difference between Python and a pit viper. Now, under his gruff, impatient tutelage, I was learning to navigate the digital arteries of the Vance Empire. "You're hesitating," Silas muttered. He didn't look up from his own screen. He was stripped down to a gray undershirt, his arms a map of tension and old scars. "If you pause at the firewall, the watchdog protocol will sniff you out. Don't think about the code. Think about the target." "I'm thinking about the consequences," I whispered, my fingers resuming their dance. "If we miss a single string, Arthur will know. He doesn't just fire people, Silas. He erases them." "I know what he does," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. He reached over, his hand brushing mine as he corrected a line of syntax. I froze. The contact was electric, but it wasn't romantic. It was a jolt of recognition. There was something about the way he worked, the way he seemed to anticipate the exact security patches Julian's team would implement next month. Not today, next month. I pulled my hand away, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. "Silas, how did you know that the encryption would use a prime 7 rotation?" He went still. The rhythmic clicking of his mechanical keyboard stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. He stared at the screen, his face unreadable in the blue glare. "It's the standard progression for Vance Tech," Silas said, but his voice lacked its usual bite. "No, it isn't," I challenged, standing up. The crate scraped loudly against the concrete. "That protocol wasn't even drafted until the 3rd quarter of next year. I only know about it because I saw the leaked internal memo in the time that hasn't happened yet." Silas finally turned to look at me. His eyes weren't just tired, they were haunted. They were the eyes I saw in the mirror every morning, the eyes of someone who had watched the world end. "It was raining," he said suddenly. The air left my lungs. "What?" "The night you died," Silas continued, his voice steady but raw. "It was Tuesday, October 14th. The rain was coming down so hard the wipers couldn't keep up. Julian had just finished his speech at the Obsidian Heights Gala. You left early because you found the folder on his desk, the one with the offshore accounts and Mia's name all over them." I felt the room tilt. I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. I hadn't told him those details. I hadn't told him about the rain or the folder. I'd only told him that I'd been in a crash. "How?" I breathed. "How do you know that?" Silas stood up, looming over me. He looked like he wanted to scream and weep all at once. "I was following you. I'd spent 6 months trying to warn you that Julian was using your name to sign off on illegal hardware shipments. I saw your car swerve. I saw the black SUV that forced you toward the cliff." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing mine. "I tried to get to you, Ellis. I ran down that embankment, Ellis. I was the one who pulled at the door handle until my fingernails tore off. I was the one who stayed with you until the car shifted and the gas line sparked." He held up his left hand. There was a jagged, faded scar running from his palm to his wrist, a mark I'd noticed before but never questioned. "I died 3 minutes after you," he whispered. The specialist didn't like witnesses. He was standing at the top of the cliff. I looked up, saw the muzzle flash, and then I woke up in this basement, a month before it all started. The double memory. It hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't the only ghost. I wasn't the only one screaming into the void of the past. For the first time since I woke up in this timeline, the porcelain mask didn't just crack. It shattered. I let out a jagged, broken sob and did something the Ellis of the first life never would have done. I reached out and grabbed him. I clung to his shirt, burying my face in his chest, feeling the frantic, living beat of a heart that had also stopped once. Silas didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me with a desperate, crushing strength. We stood there in the dark, 2 shipwrecks clinging to each other in a storm of our own making. "I thought I was alone," I choked out against his shoulder. "I thought I was the only one who remembered the smell of the smoke." "You're not alone," he murmured into my hair, his voice fierce. "But Ellis, listen to me. If both of us came back, we have to assume the rules have changed. My death wasn't an accident, and neither was yours. We aren't just here to get revenge anymore." I pulled back, looking up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "Then what are we here for?" Silas looked at the monitors, the code reflecting in his pupils like a digital prophecy. "We're here to make sure that this time, the specialist doesn't have a target to hit. We're going to burn the script before they can play their parts." The emotional weight of the room shifted. It was no longer a partnership of convenience. It was a pact of blood and memory. We were 2 ghosts who refused to stay dead. And for the first time, I felt a spark of something more dangerous than revenge. I felt hope. But as I looked at Silas's screen, I saw a new notification blinking in red. Someone was pinging his private server. Someone who used a handle I recognized from my father's deepest, darkest files. The specialist was looking for us, and in this timeline, he was ahead of schedule. The following weeks were a choreographed nightmare, a dance on the edge of a razor blade. I called it the Saboteur's Waltz. Every morning, I stepped into the role of Elara Vance, the doting, airheaded fiancé. I spent hours with Mia discussing silk swatches and hydrangea arrangements, my voice a melodic chirp of indecision. To her, I was a bird preening its feathers for a wedding. In reality, I was a virus in the system. While Mia was distracted by the sheer opulence of the wedding budget, I was clumsily using Julian's tablet to look at honeymoon destinations. "Oh, Julian, look at this private island in the Maldives," I'd giggle, leaning into him, my skin crawling at the scent of his cologne. While his arm was around my waist, my fingers were dancing across the screen, deploying the Wraith protocol Silas had built. It was a beautiful piece of sabotage. It didn't crash his system. It just breathed. It sat in the background of the Vance Tech servers, quietly mirroring every encrypted file, every secret contract, and every bit of poisoned code he was preparing for his keynote presentation. The psychological toll, however, was a debt I had to pay in blood. One afternoon, Julian insisted on driving me to a tasting. As the car pulled out of the gates, the sound of the tires on the gravel triggered a visceral, violent memory. My hands locked onto the leather seat. The smell of the car's interior, expensive leather and ozone, morphed into the smell of burning rubber and smoke. My breath hitched, a silent scream caught in my throat. "You okay, Ellis? You've gone pale," Julian said, his hand reaching over to squeeze my knee. The touch felt like a hot brand. Phantom pains. I could almost feel the glass shards embedded in my skin again. I could almost feel the cold rain on my face. Just wedding nerves, I managed to gasp, forced a smile that felt like it was cracking my face. I just want everything to be perfect. It will be, he promised, his voice slick and confident. I've made sure of it. He had no idea. At night, the mask came off. I'd slip out to the greenhouse, the only place the estate's cameras didn't fully cover, and check the encrypted feed from Silas. We were winning. We were watching Julian's revolutionary new OS, the one he intended to use to leverage the Vance patents away from my father, slowly being riddled with backdoors. Shadow S. He's moving the keynote up by a week. He's getting cocky. Ellis. Let him. The higher he climbs, the more bones he breaks when he falls. But the tension reached a breaking point during a private dinner with Arthur. My father sat at the head of the table like a king in a hollow castle. Mia was there too, laughing at one of Julian's mediocre jokes. Ellis, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife through silk. I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time in the old archives lately, looking for something. The table went silent. My heart stopped. I had been looking for information on my mother's side of the family, trying to understand why she had died so young, right before the patents were filed. Just looking for inspiration for the gala, Papa, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. I just want everything to be perfect. It will be, he promised, his voice slick and confident. I've made sure of it. He had no idea. At night, Silas sent me a file that changed everything. It wasn't code. It was a scanned document from 24 years ago, a hospital record. Shadow S. Ellis, I think I know why you were targeted in the first life. Look at the blood type on the birth certificate. I opened the file. My breath hitched. My mother's blood type was O negative. My father's, Arthur's, was AB positive. According to every law of biology, I couldn't be her daughter. I wasn't just a Stepford bride or a pawn in a corporate game. I was a living, breathing lie. The Vance legacy wasn't mine to inherit because Arthur Vance wasn't my father. He was the man who had stolen my life before I was even old enough to remember it. The waltz was over. The music had stopped, and I was the only one who realized the ballroom was on fire. I'm going to burn it all, I whispered to the empty greenhouse, the moonlight reflecting on the ring on my finger. Not just Julian, not just Mia. I'm going to burn the name Vance until there's nothing left but ash. But as I turned to leave, a shadow moved by the door. Going somewhere, Ellis? It was Mia, and she wasn't smiling. The silence in the greenhouse was heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a cloying, sweet smell that suddenly felt like the air in a funeral parlor. Mia stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. The doting sister mask was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating hunger. You've been acting strange, Ellis, she said, her voice dropping the high-pitched chirp she used in front of Julian. She stepped inside, the heels of her shoes clicking like a metronome on the stone floor. Late-night walks? Secret laptops? You're not just a bride-to-be. You're a squirrel burying nuts. The question is, what are you trying to hide from the rest of us? My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird sensing the hawk. I had two choices, lie poorly and get caught, or lean into the one thing I knew Mia couldn't resist. Greed. I'm not hiding anything from you, Mia, I said, my voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial whisper. I moved toward her, letting a flicker of fear touch my eyes. I'm hiding it from Papa and from Julian. Mia paused, her eyes narrowing. Explain. I found out Julian is planning to sideline both of us after the merger. I lied, the words tasting like copper. He has a secondary contract drafted, one that leaves you with nothing but a consultant fee and pushes me into a private wellness retreat in Switzerland the moment the ink is dry. I'm not just burying nuts, Mia. I'm building a bunker. I saw the flicker of doubt, then the spark of self-interest. Mia didn't love Julian. She loved the power he promised. If that power was a lie, she was my most dangerous ally. "Prove it," she demanded. "Check the Project Icarus subfolder on his personal drive tomorrow. The password is the date of our first anniversary. Look for the liquidation PDF. Then tell me if you still want to play the supportive bridesmaid." I knew Silas could plant a fake document in the time it took for Mia to blink. She stared at me for a long beat, searching for the crack in my porcelain mask. Finally, she gave a stiff, jerky nod. "If you're lying to me, Ellis, I'll tell Arthur you're unstable. You know what he does to unstable things." She turned and vanished into the shadows of the estate. I didn't breathe until the sound of the heavy oak door echoed through the gardens. I scrambled back to my hidden laptop. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type the decryption sequence Silas had sent. The bloodline audit. The file I had discovered wasn't just a record of blood types. It was a dossier of a ghost. As the progress bar hit 100, a series of scanned photographs and police reports filled the screen. The first photo was of a young couple, a man with kind eyes and a woman who had my exact chin, my exact smile. They were standing in front of a small, cramped garage in the valley. The sign above them read, "Sterling Cross Tech Lab." I scrolled down. Report. Industrial accident. October 1999, a gas leak led to an explosion at the Sterling Cross facility. No survivors. Biological daughter, Ellis Sterling, age 2, recovered from the scene. My breath hitched. My name wasn't Ellis Vance. It never had been. I scrolled further, my eyes blurring with tears of pure, cold rage. There was a legal document signed by Arthur Vance just 3 days after the explosion. He hadn't adopted a grieving orphan out of the goodness of his heart. He filed for guardianship and, in the same breath, filed a patent claim for the V-Core technology, the very tech my real parents, the Sterlings, had spent their lives developing. The industrial accident was a hit. Arthur Vance didn't just steal a company, he stole a family. He kept me close for 24 years like a trophy or a backup key. He needed me alive because the Sterling Cross patents had a blood lineage clause, a fail-safe my father must have built in. To fully control the tech, Arthur needed a Sterling heir under his thumb. In my first life, when I finally started asking questions about my mother, when I started looking into these Sterling names in the old ledgers, that's when the accident was ordered. I wasn't a daughter. I was a legal technicality. "Ellis?" Silas's voice crackled through the encrypted audio link on the laptop. "You there? I just saw the files. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, Silas," I whispered, staring at the photo of the woman who gave me my smile. The grief was there, a hollow ache in my chest, but it was being rapidly cauterized by a white-hot, transformative fury. "Silas," I said, my voice dropping into a low, cold register that surprised even me. "Forget the backdoors. Forget the corporate sabotage. I don't just want to bankrupt them." "What do you want?" Silas asked, his voice low and cautious. "I want the world to see Arthur Vance for exactly what he is, and I want him to watch while I take back the name he tried to bury in the ash." I closed the laptop and looked toward the looming silhouette of Obsidian Heights. The lights were on in Arthur's study. He was up there, sipping expensive scotch, thinking he was the master of the world. He didn't know that the girl he saved was finally home, and this time she brought the fire with her. Arthur's study wasn't a room. It was a mausoleum of other people's failures. High, vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow, and the walls were lined with leather-bound books that looked like they hadn't been opened in a century. It smelled of old paper, expensive scotch, and the cold, metallic scent of a man who had replaced his heart with a balance sheet. I stood in the center of the Persian rug, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. Silas was in my ear, his voice a low, digital hum through the microscopic earpiece. "The floor safe is under the mahogany sideboard," Silas whispered. "But Ellis, the security grid is active. If you don't input the bypass within 12 seconds, the silent alarm goes straight to Arthur's personal security detail. You'll be trapped in there before you can blink." "I'm moving," I breathed. I knelt on the cold floor, my fingers trembling as I pulled back the heavy rug. My porcelain mask was starting to feel heavy, like actual clay drying on my skin. I found the keypad. 0, 10, 14. The date of my death. The safe clicked open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Inside wasn't gold or stacks of cash. It was a single obsidian-colored digital recorder and a physical file titled Contingency Sterling. I grabbed the recorder and hit play, my breath hitching as the speakers hissed to life. "She's becoming a liability, Arthur." It was Julian's voice, but it sounded different, smaller, more desperate. This wasn't the confident predator I knew. "She's not a liability, Julian. She's an asset that needs to be liquidated at the peak of its value," Arthur's voice replied. It was as cold as a winter grave. "You're doing well. Keep the affair with Mia visible. Let Ellis find the messages. I need her fragile. I need her questioning her own reality. By the time the gala arrives, everyone should believe she's on the verge of a nervous breakdown." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I had spent weeks hating Julian for his betrayal, hating Mia for her greed. But as I listened, the truth began to bleed through the tape. "And what about Mia?" Julian asked. "She's getting impatient. She wants her half of the Sterling Trust." "Mia is a parasite," Arthur said, and I could almost hear the thin, cruel smile in his voice. "Once the patents are fully transferred through your marriage and Ellis's unfortunate end, we'll settle Mia's accounts. Permanently. A tragic overdose, perhaps. Grief for her sister is a powerful motivator for self-destruction." I sank back onto my heels, the recorder feeling like a live coal in my hand. I wasn't the only one being hunted. Julian and Mia, the people I thought were the architects of my misery, were nothing more than disposable tools. Arthur had hand-picked them because they were greedy and shallow. He had groomed Julian to be a murderer and Mia to be a traitor, and then he had planned to discard them like used tissues once the Sterling legacy was firmly in his grasp. My hatred for them suddenly felt hollow, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline clarity. I wasn't playing a game of chess against Julian. I was a rat in a maze, and Arthur was the one who built the walls, painted the path, and now was preparing to flood the chamber. "Ellis, what is it?" Silas's voice was urgent. "Your heart rate is spiking. Get out of there." "He's not just killing me, Silas," I whispered, my eyes fixed on the shadows in the corner of the room. "He's killing us all. He wants the Sterling name to end with me, and he wants the Vance name to be wiped clean of any witnesses. He's the only one who walks away from this." I realized then that my revenge had been too small. I had been focused on the hand that held the knife, not the mind that commanded the hand. Suddenly, the lights in the study flickered and died. The room was plunged into a suffocating darkness, the only light coming from the moon through the high windows. "Ellis, get out now," Silas shouted in my ear. "Someone just manually overrode the security system from inside the house. The study door is locking." I bolted for the door, my boots skidding on the polished wood, but the heavy oak slab slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. I pulled at the handle. Locked. A soft, rhythmic clapping sound emerged from the darkness near the fireplace. "You always did have your mother's curiosity, Ellis," a voice said. A match flared. In the flickering orange light, Arthur Vance sat in a wingback chair, a glass of scotch in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. He looked perfectly at peace, as if we were just settling in for a bedtime story. "But curiosity," he continued, his eyes reflecting the flame like a cat's, "is a very dangerous trait for a girl who's supposed to be dead." The puppet master hadn't been waiting for the gala. He had been waiting for me to step into his sanctum, and now the maze had no exits. The cold barrel of the silenced pistol didn't scare me as much as the silence in Arthur's eyes. He didn't look like a man about to commit a murder. He looked like a man taking out the trash. "You were always the flaw in the design, Ellis," Arthur said, his voice a low, melodic vibration. "Your parents were brilliant, but they were soft. They thought technology belonged to the world. I knew it belonged to the man who could protect it. I've protected this legacy for 24 years. Did you really think a little time-traveling spite would stop me?" My breath hitched. "Time-traveling spite? Do you know?" I whispered. "I know that people don't change overnight," Arthur said, standing up. The shadows stretched behind him like wings. "I know that a girl who couldn't balance a checkbook doesn't suddenly start liquidating offshore assets unless she has help from the dead. But it doesn't matter how many lives you live, Ellis. You always end up in the same place, at my feet." "I'm not at your feet, Arthur," I said, my voice trembling but my eyes fixed on his. "I'm at your throat." I didn't look at the door. I looked at the clock on the mantel. 8 p.m., the exact moment the gala downstairs was scheduled to begin. "Now, Silas!" I screamed. The world exploded in sound. Not a gunshot, but the deafening, bone-shaking blare of the estate's fire klaxons. The sprinklers overhead hissed to life, drenching the mahogany study in a freezing downpour. In the chaos, the electronic lock on the door clicked. Silas had overridden the entire grid. Arthur hesitated for a fraction of a second, his silk suit soaking through. And that was all I needed. I lunged past him, slamming my shoulder into his chest and bolting through the door. I didn't run for the stairs. I ran for the service elevator. 10 minutes later, I stood behind the velvet curtains of the grand ballroom. My silver dress was damp, clinging to my skin like armor, but my porcelain mask was gone. In its place was something much older, much hungrier. I stepped out onto the stage just as Julian was finishing his introductory speech. The room was packed with the elite of the tech world, the press, and the board members. Julian looked perfect, until he saw me. He faltered, his eyes wide as he saw the wet, shivering, but triumphant woman walking toward him. "And now," Julian stammered, trying to recover, "my beautiful fiancé will help me launch the future of Vance Tech, the V-Core 2.0. He gestured to the massive 60-foot LED screen behind us. He pressed the button on his remote, expecting to see the sleek golden logo of his new operating system. Instead, the screen flickered to a grainy black-and-white police photo of a burning garage. The room went deathly silent. "That isn't the future, Julian," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone on my lapel, ringing out like a bell through the hall. "That's the past. That's the day Arthur Vance murdered David and Sarah Sterling to steal the technology you're standing on today." "Ellis, stop this," Mia shouted from the front row, her face pale with terror. "I'm not Ellis Vance," I roared, turning to the crowd. "My name is Ellis Sterling, and the man who calls himself my father is a thief and a killer." The screen shifted. Silas had synced the audio recorder I'd stolen from the safe. Arthur's voice filled the ballroom, cold and clinical, discussing the liquidation of his own daughter and the disposal of Julian and Mia. I watched Julian's face go from confusion to a sickening gray realization. He looked at Arthur, who had just appeared at the back of the room, dripping wet and fuming. He realized in that moment his inheritance was a death sentence. "He was going to kill me?" Mia shrieked, her voice breaking the spell of the crowd. She turned on Arthur, her greed finally turning into a weapon. "You promised me half. You told me she was the only one who had to go." It was the final nail. The perfect Vance family began to devour itself in front of the world's cameras. Julian, desperate to save himself, grabbed the microphone. "I didn't know about the murders. I only followed his orders. He made me do it." I stood in the center of the storm, watching the empire crumble. The V-Core patents, the ones Arthur had killed for, began to scroll across the screen, not as protected code, but as open-source files. Silas was releasing them to the world in real time. The Vance legacy was being erased, one line of code at a time. Arthur didn't run. He stood at the back of the hall, his eyes locked on mine. He raised his hand, pointing a finger at me like a curse, but the blue and red lights of the police were already reflecting in the glass walls of the ballroom. As the officers swarmed the room, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't Julian's. It was Silas. He had fought his way through the crowd, his face bruised, but his eyes bright with a relief I hadn't seen in 2 lifetimes. "It's over," he whispered. I looked at the screen where the last of the Vance patents had just been deleted. I looked at the ring on my finger, then pulled it off, letting the 5-carat lie clatter onto the stage floor. I had been reborn to get revenge. I had been reborn to kill the man who killed me. But as I stood there, no longer a Vance, no longer a ghost, I realized I had done something much better. I had finally given the Sterling name a life that wasn't a tragedy.
The silence that followed the gala was louder than the sirens. 3 days later, I stood on the jagged cliff's edge, the very spot where the world had ended for me the first time. Below, the ocean was a churning cauldron of white foam and black water, indifferent to the scandals of humans. Behind me, the Obsidian Heights estate sat like a hollowed-out skull. The lights were off, the staff had fled. The Vance name had been scrubbed from the gates by protesters and creditors alike. Arthur was in a high-security cell, facing charges of double homicide and decades of racketeering. Julian and Mia were busy turning on each other in separate interrogation rooms, trading secrets for plea deals that would never come. I looked down at my hands. They didn't feel like the hands of a victim anymore. They felt heavy, as if the weight of 2 lifetimes had finally settled into my bones. "It's strange," a voice said from the shadows of the cypress trees. I didn't have to turn around. Silas stepped up beside me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark overcoat. He looked cleaner, his face healing, but the haunted look in his eyes remained. We were 2 ghosts who had finally found our way back to the graveyard. "What is?" I asked. "The house," he said, nodding toward the mansion. "In the last life, I used to dream about burning it down. I thought the fire would be the most beautiful thing I'd ever see. But watching it just go dark, it's worse. It's like it never existed at all." "That's the point, Silas," I said, my voice barely a whisper against the wind. I didn't want a spectacular ending. I wanted a deletion. I had officially signed the papers that morning. The Sterling patents were now public domain. The technology that had built a billionaire's throne was now free for every medical lab and small-scale developer in the world. I hadn't just taken Arthur's empire. I had made it so the empire could never be rebuilt. I was penniless now, at least on paper. But for the first time in 25 years, I was Ellis Sterling. "What now?" Silas asked. "The police are done with us. The lawyers are happy. We have new names, new passports. We could go anywhere." "I don't know," I admitted. I looked at him,
The man who died trying to save a girl he barely knew, and the man who lived to help a woman he'd grown to respect. How do you live a life when you already know how it's supposed to end? You don't, Silas said, finally looking at me. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. The script is gone, Ellis. We're ad-libbing now.
1 month later, I was sitting in a small, sun-drenched cafe in a coastal town 4,000 miles away from Obsidian Heights. My hair was shorter, dyed a deep chestnut. I wore a simple cotton dress and no jewelry. To the locals, I was just Claire, a quiet artist who spent her afternoons sketching the harbor. Silas was at a table across the street, working on a laptop, his life finally free from the basement shadows. We weren't a couple in the traditional sense. We were something deeper, witnesses to a miracle that felt like a curse. The waiter approached, setting a small vase on my table. Inside was a single drooping branch of a willow tree. My heart skipped a beat. A willow? It wasn't a local plant. It was a species that grew in only one place I knew, the valley surrounding my true parents' old laboratory. "A gentleman left this for you," the waiter said, nodding toward the door. "He said you'd recognize the sentiment." "What gentleman?" I asked, my voice suddenly sharp. "Tall, gray hair, very elegant. He left a note." The waiter handed me a small, cream-colored envelope. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, there was no name, only 6 words written in a precise, familiar calligraphy that made the blood in my veins turn to slush. Some things are meant to happen twice. I looked up, scanning the crowded street, my eyes searching every face, every shadow. The sun was bright, the world was moving, and yet I felt that familiar icy chill of the rain on the windshield. I looked at Silas. He had seen my reaction and was already standing up, his eyes darting around the square. I looked back at the willow branch. It wasn't just a plant. In the language of flowers, the willow represents both freedom and mourning. But in the world of Arthur Vance, it was something else. It was the name of the specialist's private estate. I realized then that while I had burned the empire, I hadn't destroyed the architect. Arthur had planned for his arrest. He had planned for the collapse. And somewhere out there, another player, perhaps someone who had also seen the end of the world, was reset on the board. The hunt wasn't over. It had just moved to a larger map. I gripped the willow branch until the bark bit into my palm. I looked at Silas and gave a single, firm nod. We weren't going to run. We weren't going to hide. Because if fate wanted a third round, I was more than ready to show it exactly how much I had learned from the first 2.